Hannah Nicole Driver. On December 8th of 2020, she was 13 months old. This is not the way that you will see her in this trial. Instead, you will see her the way that first responding officers saw her, the way that the EMTs saw her, the way that the ER doctor saw her, and eventually the way that the medical examiner saw her. You will see this 13-month-old beautiful baby girl who had been brutally murdered by her mother, stabbed repeatedly until every bit of life drained out of her, and she died. But I wanted to start with a picture of what Hannah Nicole Driver was like before that happened. You are going to hear that Chloe Driver was her mother, and Chloe Driver was involved in an alternative lifestyle. You're going to hear, as the week goes on, a lot of distracting evidence. You are going to hear a lot of messy evidence about this group, about their belief systems. You are going to hear a lot of things that take the focus off of Hannah Nicole Driver. And I wanted to start with this photo because what your role is in this case, and what your decision is in this case, is what happened to Hannah. And what the laws are governing the death of Hannah. And what your decision is with regard to the murder of Hannah. But you will be confronted this week with a lot of shiny objects, a lot of dramatic, crazy evidence about these people and their viewpoints and their belief systems and their practices. You're going to hear that Chloe Driver was one of 3 wives of a man named Brian Joyce. All of them had alternative religious names that they assigned to each other. Brian Joyce also went by the name Benjamin Ben Michael. Some people call him Z. Chloe Driver went by the name Kuwani. Hannah, the baby, they called Nimsi. The other 2 wives, Jessica and Sarah, they had other religious names as well. But the evidence will be that that group, that core group of 3 wives and the husband, Benjamin, that of the 3 wives in 2020, Chloe had been with Benjamin the longest. Of the 3 wives, she was the longest surviving wife of that group. And then after her came Jessica, who had been in the group for about 2 years. Chloe had been with him for about 3 years. And then Sarah came last. She had been with him for less than a year. But they all lived together as a family. Chloe had a baby, Hannah, with Benjamin. And so it was Benjamin, the 3 wives, and the baby. You'll also hear the evidence that there was another individual that spent a lot of time with them, traveled with them, participated in a lot of their same belief systems. His name's Jason Spillers. You'll see him in this case and hear evidence from him as well. So the belief system. What you will hear is that they had very sort of radical views. They were strict vegans. They only drank purified water. They did not believe in any type of drugs or alcohol, no modern medicine. Hannah never had a birth certificate or went to the doctor. You'll hear that they participated in alternative healing practices like drinking their own urine, sensory deprivation, meditation, that they did not believe in modern medicine. You will hear that they collectively as a group engaged in this sort of thought process that they had a higher consciousness than the rest of the world, that they were called upon to challenge the realities of sort of the traditional worldview. And that was something that they all leaned into and felt pride in. And it was collective as the group. They were all like-minded in that way. Now, you're also going to hear that they were pretty nomadic, that they didn't have strong roots anywhere, that they traveled around a lot, that they bounced from place to place, spent time in different locations. None of them were from Cherokee County. It was a sheer coincidence that this act happened in our jurisdiction, and I'll get into that. On December the 8th of 2020, they were traveling from North Carolina down to Florida. Benjamin, the husband, had previously lived in a residence at 215 Mountain Vista Boulevard in Canton, Georgia, with a man by the name of Gerald Ablin. Gerald Ablin still lived in that residence on December the 8th of 2020, and so in their travels, Benjamin, Jason Spillers, and 3 wives, Sarah, Jessica, Chloe, and the baby, Hannah, were all caravanning from North Carolina down to Florida in 4 different vehicles, a U-Haul and 3 cars, and they were planning to move down to Florida, and they stopped at Jerry Ablin's house in Canton, Georgia, 3 miles from this courthouse, because Benjamin had stuff in Jerry's basement. And so the plan was for Jason and Benjamin to load up the stuff that was in Jerry's basement into the U-Haul and to get back on the road and head to Florida. What happened was, when they got there, 2 of the wives, Sarah and Jessica, went to one of the upstairs bedrooms to take a nap. And Hannah and Chloe went to another upstairs bedroom to take a nap. Gerald Ablin, the homeowner, worked from home. He's a software engineer. So he was on a Zoom call working, and the women and the baby went to the room so they didn't disturb him. And Jason Spillers and Benjamin went to work moving the things out of the basement into the U-Haul. It was supposed to be a seemingly short stopover, and then they would all get back on the road. And when they were done, and it was time to leave, something happened. This is the residence. You'll hear that when Jason and Benjamin were distracted moving things out of the basement, Chloe Driver, at some point, went down to the kitchen, got a knife out of the knife block, returned to the room with Hannah, locked the door behind her, and repeatedly stabbed Hannah to death with this knife. She then took the knife and stabbed herself in the neck. This is where Hannah Driver bled to death. You will hear that Jason and Benjamin were out in the driveway. They were getting ready to go. Sarah and Jessica had come down. They were in the driveway getting ready to go. And Benjamin went upstairs to get Chloe and the baby. And the door was locked. And he heard noises. And he panicked. And he kicked the door down. And he found the scene of his 13-month-old daughter bleeding to death on the bed, and Chloe on the ground with a knife wound to her neck as well. You'll see evidence of him kicking in the door. And you'll hear the witnesses who said they heard the most blood-curdling scream from him. What did you do? What did you do? You will see the body cam footage of the first responders on the scene who rushed in to try to save the baby and Chloe Driver. And what you will see is Benjamin with his hands on Hannah's neck trying to keep her from bleeding to death, and Jason Spillers, the other man that's a part of this group, with his hands on Chloe's neck trying to save her life. You will see these men were in shock. They were desperately trying to help. And you will see the response of first responders, EMTs, and everybody who did everything they could for Hannah and Chloe. You will hear that Hannah died, that she had 4 stab wounds. One of them was a 1.5-inch deep stab wound to her back. The other wounds were 3 stab wounds to the neck, one of which was so deep that it went all the way through her tiny neck, transected her carotid artery, and hit her vertebrae. You are going to hear a lot of evidence about Benjamin, and I don't particularly expect you to like him. I expect you are going to hear that they're not from Cherokee County. But what I want you to remember in this trial is that their belief system and practices are not on trial. We only have jurisdiction over crimes that happened in Cherokee County. And what the evidence will be is that the only crime that happened in Cherokee County was a crime that was committed by Chloe Driver. the evidence will show that the only act committed by Benjamin in Cherokee County was the desperate act to save his baby daughter. And you will see it. Now, the state has the burden of proving that she murdered Hannah and that she intended Hannah's death. And that will be very, very clear from the evidence. The defense is raising the issue of insanity and going to ask you to find her not guilty by reason of insanity. And that is their burden to prove. There is a legal definition of what insanity is, and opening statements are not necessarily the appropriate time for us to get into what the law is and how you apply the law. That will be something that comes at the end of this trial. But what opening statements are for is to give you a roadmap, to help you focus on the important issues and to help you know what to look for when the evidence is coming before you. And so in that regard, the things that I can appropriately tell you is you're going to hear a lot of things in this case about throwing witnesses and evidence, throwing around terms like crazy, mentally ill, insane. And you, as human beings that know the English language, probably use all of those terms kind of interchangeably. But the truth is the law has definitions for things, and they are not the same. So what I would like for you to pay attention to in the presentation of evidence in this case is the evidence that she understood the wrongfulness of her actions, that she understood the difference between wrong and right. And there will be plenty of evidence presented to you that she did. One of those pieces of evidence is when she was sitting in the hospital bed, one of the first things that she wrote to law enforcement, because she could not speak because she had a trach, was, "How long will my prison sentence be for killing her?" This is the evidence that will come before you that demonstrates that she understood the wrongfulness of her actions. Pay attention. She locked the door. She waited until she was isolated. Those are pieces of evidence that will come before you that are important. The next thing I would like you to pay attention to in the presentation of evidence is why she killed Hannah. There will be evidence about why she killed Hannah. Pay very, very close attention to what motivated her actions. He didn't do it, I did it. I was going insane and no longer wanted to be with his friends, but kept coming back for him. I only wanted my baby and husband, but he refused. The evidence will be she wanted him. She wanted to be with him. She was the first of this group of 3 wives, and the 2 others came after her. The evidence will be clear that she wanted to be with him, and he was never going to give up this polygamous cult lifestyle that they had adopted. This was one of the first writings that she made about why she killed Hannah. Pay attention to the why. Her cell phone was searched, and you'll see evidence of that. She searched killing somebody to save them. Also, a couple of weeks before she killed Hannah, she searched how to snap a neck. The evidence is going to be she was evaluated in the hospital by a psychiatrist shortly after she killed Hannah, and he indicated patient felt the only way out was to kill her daughter and herself. I couldn't handle being with the group anymore, and you left no alternative with certain threats. This was her note that she wrote to Benjamin. She wanted him and the baby, and she wanted everybody else to go. And that wasn't an option, so she picked a different one. There is going to be evidence in this case that she believed some things that were pretty crazy. And there's that word again, crazy. And it doesn't have a legal definition. You're going to be focused more on mental illness and insanity and making your determination. But just in the English language context, there's going to be evidence that comes before you that sounds insane. There is going to be evidence that she believed things that the rest of the group believed too. That the world is fake, that we're living in hell, that they have the ability to with their minds, control the actions of other people around them. These things were not unique to Chloe Driver. The entire group believed that this higher level of consciousness was something that they were called upon to do, to serve the world. And so what I ask you to do when you are assessing these things is, there may be a question about whether these are delusions or whether these are just genuinely held religious views that maybe are untraditional that the rest of the world doesn't agree with. And that's something that you're going to have to parse out. But here's the thing that is very, very clear and will be very important to your determination in this case. None of these bizarre views had anything to do with Hannah. That is of critical importance. I started with a picture of Hannah, and I'm going back to it, because when we talk about the issue of insanity that will be raised in this case, you have to focus on how her belief system, her mind, her thoughts, how those things related to Hannah, her feelings about Hannah, the reason she committed the act against Hannah. You cannot just say she has crazy beliefs without considering Hannah. So in this case, what you will hear and what the evidence will show is not a single witness, not a single doctor that evaluated her, not a single statement Chloe Driver has ever made was that she believed Hannah was any kind of a threat to her. There will be no evidence of that. You will not hear that she was ever afraid of Hannah. You will not hear that she ever felt like she needed to defend herself against Hannah. And how she felt about Hannah in her mind and in her actions and informing her intent is something that you need to pay attention to in this case. It will help you solve the legal equation. Whether she had delusions or not is a teeny tiny part of the legal equation you will solve. The evidence that will come before you is none of that stuff related to the reasons why she committed this act against Hannah or her beliefs about Hannah, the baby, the victim in this case. You are going to have to evaluate the evidence that comes before you about whether any of her belief systems were manifestations of mental illness and how that related to the act that she committed. And what the evidence is going to be is that any manifestations of mental illness were completely separate from the motivations for why she killed Hannah. The evidence is going to be that her motivation for why she killed Hannah wasn't her delusions, it was her reality. The evidence is going to be that she couldn't decide if she wanted to stay or go, so she picked a third option. And the evidence is going to show that that wasn't delusional at all. That was very reasonable thinking based upon the situation she willfully put herself in. I suspect in this case there is going to be a lot of effort to paint Chloe Driver as the victim instead of this baby girl. You are going to hear that she was held against her will, she didn't feel like she was free to leave, but the evidence is going to demonstrate that that is not true. The evidence is going to demonstrate that as she sat there and stabbed Hannah to death, she had a diaper bag with her personal effects in it, and inside that diaper bag was a cell phone, $1,000 cash, blank checks in the name of Chloe Alexis Driver that connected to a bank account in the name of Chloe Alexis Driver that had $65,000 in it. She had the means to leave. The evidence is going to be she didn't want to. She wanted him. She had supportive parents who she had seen the day before she murdered Hannah. And instead, she chose to go with the group. That is what the evidence is going to be. The evidence will not be that she was held against her will. The evidence will be that she exercised her free will in wanting to be with Benjamin. The evidence will be that at every opportunity, she took the opportunity to maintain her relationship with him, even after she murdered Hannah. The evidence will be that she wanted to have her cake and eat it too. Even after she was arrested and charged with murder, the evidence that will come before you is that
she was simultaneously talking to doctors, speaking to lawyers, evaluating her options for a defense in this case, telling them that she was an oppressed victim of this religious cult to shirk responsibility for her criminal actions and placing the blame on Benjamin, saying all those things to the doctors and professionals that were evaluating her, while simultaneously continuing to maintain conversations with him, continuing to maintain a relationship with him, making hundreds of phone calls to him and telling him how much she loved him. Phone calls that she placed out. He could not call her. The evidence will not be that she could not exercise free will. The evidence will be that she wanted to be with him. What you are going to hear is probably that this cult lifestyle wasn't great for her mental health. But that is not the issue before you in this case. The evidence is going to be that Chloe Driver was swimming in the pond she jumped in. And she did it willfully. It was the air that she breathed. And she chose that even after she took the life of Hannah Nicole Driver. You will not hear that she was deprived of free will. You will see that she exercised her free will. And the person that suffered the consequences of her choices was Hannah, not Chloe. The evidence will be clear that Chloe murdered Hannah. She did it willfully, she did it intentionally, and she wanted her to die. The evidence will also demonstrate, maybe, that Chloe was a weak-minded person who was particularly susceptible to the cult lifestyle. But that is not the issue before you. The evidence will not demonstrate that she meets the definition of criminal insanity to the extent that she cannot be held responsible for her actions. And once all of the evidence has come before you, and all of the witnesses have been questioned, I'm going to ask you to hold her responsible for the consequences that this child suffered from her choices and her decisions. And I'm going to ask you to find her guilty.
All right, Ms. Trethewey.
Good morning. I want to make one thing abundantly clear from the outset of this case, and that no one in this courtroom is going to stand here and dispute that the murder of a child is a horrific event. This is a tragic and heartbreaking case. There's simply no other way to explain it. There's no rational way to explain that. There is no dispute as to the facts regarding the events that occurred on December 8th of 2020 at 215 Mountain Vista Boulevard here in Canton. Ms. Driver does not dispute that she killed her 13-month-old baby daughter, Hannah Nicole Driver. There is also no dispute that at the same time, Ms. Driver stabbed herself repeatedly in the neck, not once, not twice, not 3 times, 4 times, and then took the knife to her chest. There is no doubt that the evidence in this case and the testimony you're going to hear by the state of the defendant will not only be difficult to see and hear, but as we go through this trial, the only issue in this case that you need to decide is Ms. Driver's mental status and mental state at the time of the crime. Solely focus as we sit here and present all of this evidence about what happened that day, and the state does that, on her mental health. We are not standing here saying that Hannah Nicole Driver is not a victim. That is not the position taken by anybody in this case. Our job is to simply show you how we got here today and that the law allows you to consider her mental state at the time of the crime. I'm going to give you a little bit more background information about the people involved in this case so you have some sort of context. Today, our client, Chloe, she's 24 years old. She grew up in Florida and in the Knoxville, Tennessee area. Her parents are Eric and Renee Driver. She is one of 3 children, the youngest and only daughter. Ms. Driver did have her ups and downs and bouts with teenage angst, and she, like most teenagers, thought she was ready for the world and knew best at the age of 16. She left home, she left school. She had her first fateful meeting with Benjamin Ben Michael when she was 16 years old at a bus station in Atlanta. Several months after the breaking up with her boyfriend, she had just turned 17, she met up with Benjamin again. He was 38 years old. See, I'll tell you a little bit about Mr. Benjamin Ben Michael. He's not this great character that the state intends to put up here. Not at all. He spends his free time setting up Christian trusts in the name of religion and his wacky beliefs. You will hear that some of these trusts include contracts that he made with his so-called wives. I'm not even going to attempt to try to explain what these trusts are, because quite frankly, we really don't understand what their thought process is involved in that, and I'm sure Mr. Spillers would love to tell you all about it. You will hear that he had 3 wives at this time. He had Jessica, he had Chloe, he had Sarah. He actually knew Jessica prior to ever meeting Chloe. But Chloe was his first wife, and Jessica came back into the picture at a later time because she had money. She had some money stashed away, and Mr. Ben Michael knew that. Sarah Stiles did come along longer. She wasn't involved in this group until after Chloe had had her baby. See, he creates contracts with each one of these women and calls them his wives in trust. You will also hear evidence that Benjamin had not only Chloe, but these other wives file during COVID for the fraudulent EIDL loan money through the Small Business Administration. He had each one of them apply for these under his Alorian Christian Trust, or other pseudo-trust that he called a 501c3, a 508c something, under the organization of spirituality and teaching. You will hear that they were able to get $150,000 fraudulently. That's the money sitting in the Wells Fargo account. They traveled all around the eastern United States. Sometimes they were together, sometimes they were not, depending on where he wanted each of these women. They definitely lived what we would consider an alternative lifestyle. This lifestyle didn't involve the things that you and I would normally think would be a partnership or a relationship, or the type of rules that we would necessarily agree with. There were rules of what to eat, what to wear, who they could talk to, when she would have access to her cell phone, when she'd be able to speak to her parents. Same rules applied to all 3 women. It was a constant indoctrination of an alternative ideology and belief system to an already vulnerable young lady. A 17, 18, and 19-year-old woman with a 38, 39, and 40-year-old man. He did assign his wives each alternative names. You'll hear in these calls and interviews they'll refer to her as Kalani. Chloe, initially, was all in this relationship. She really didn't know any better. She was shocked and awed by his personality. She was young, and she was vulnerable. She became alienated from her friends and her family, and she did. She followed his teachings and belief system. He also manipulated her mind to the extent about her own belief system, about her own parents. Repeatedly telling her that she could not trust her parents and that they may have done horrible things to her as a child. She couldn't and did not realize that this was essentially a cult environment. Around April of 2020, Benjamin met Jason Spillers, and they immediately became friends. They became fascinated with his trust system, the idea of having multiple women involved, quickly realized that they shared similar beliefs. To this day, they remain very close to each other. Mr. Spillers traveled around as well from place to place and was in a group on several different occasions with them, leading up to December 8th. When he was not with Benjamin or this group, he remained in constant contact via phone, text, or other means. Mr. Spillers saw Chloe in May of 2020. Will describe her as a loving, caring mom. No issues, no signs of mental illness. In September of 2020, he noted that her mental state had deteriorated and became concerned. We even spoke to Brian about it. There were discussions about her needing treatment and medication, but see, Mr. Ben Michael doesn't agree with pharmaceuticals. He doesn't believe with white coat intervention, as he calls it. He was not going to let her put any medication in her body because she was breastfeeding, and she needed to be pure. He also believed that he could self-diagnose and self-treat Chloe on his own. Now, there were several red flags and calls for help leading up to this event. And the state didn't tell you about it, but I'm going to. Several people who claim to love Chloe and care about her are the same people who refused to get her the help she desperately needed and asked for. Benjamin, his other wives, Jason Spillers, Chloe's own parents. They either all chose not to help her and ignore her cries for help, or they just could not break through to her in those fateful months and get her that help she so desperately needed and that she asked for. The responses to her erratic behavior, her expressions of the thoughts that were in her mind to these people were ignored. Rather, in September of 2020, instead of getting her actual mental help, Benjamin convinced her to start taking CBD to help regulate herself and calm her down. You will hear testimony that they continued to feed her this CBD from Mr. Spillers that not only increased the erratic behavior, but led to an increase in her delusions and the continued degradation of her condition. There were two significant incidents that I want you to think about through this trial that show a continued decline of her mental health leading up to this and the lack of help for her deteriorating mental state. On November 25th, 2020, this group was in Asheville, North Carolina. Chloe Driver ran out of an apartment, through an apartment complex parking lot, into oncoming traffic to escape this group. She was having a major mental health crisis episode. During that time, she was begging strangers to help her get away from him and get help. She was young, she was crazy. I expect you to hear from a lady named Sandra Torres. She is a completely independent witness. Doesn't know Benjamin, doesn't know Jason, doesn't know Chloe, who saw this young lady on that day in the middle of the road, crying and asking for help, being chased by Jason Spillers. She sees him pick her up and drag her back into that apartment. She calls 911. And what is the result of her help? She was hit by a car that Benjamin was driving and punched in the eye by Jason Spillers. He broke her eye socket. She will tell you that Chloe was begging for help, begging to call the police, begging them to call her parents to help. These men put Chloe in a car, put Hannah in a car, and drove away before the police could ever respond. There are police reports about this. You will hear that the next day, Thanksgiving of 2020, November 26th, that Chloe had access to her cell phone. She contacted her parents to please come and get her in Asheville, North Carolina with Hannah and help her get away. That Brian was hurting her, she was afraid, she needed help. Her parents immediately got in the car and started to make that 2-hour drive to Asheville. Benjamin went through her phone, found out that they were coming, and the result was he took the child before her parents or the police could get there. took the child away from Chloe and kept her away from her child for over 2.5 days. Police reported about that too. When her parents picked her up that day, Miss Driver had a black eye, the remnants of a healing black eye. It's documented in a police report as well. Chloe went with her parents. She was distraught. She was upset. She was afraid that she was never going to see her daughter again. He kept her away from the baby. Expect you to see the Facebook messages and text messages exchanged between the two that indicate the manipulation and the games he played with Chloe that day and over the course of those 2 days to get her child back. She was even more distraught because she was still breastfeeding her daughter. That was the first time that her parents had ever learned about what was going on with Chloe, both with her mental status and the relationship. Her parents were desperate to intervene. They helped her try to figure out how to get her own bank account, how to obtain Hannah's birth certificate, because they left the hospital shortly after she was born, because Mr. Ben Michael didn't want her in the system and was afraid that DFACS was going to be called. They left without a birth certificate. She feared that she would never see her daughter again. I expect you'll see a video that was taken on November 27th of 2020 with Miss Driver. That video was taken prior to Miss Driver getting in an Uber that Mr. Ben Michael sent for her to bring her back to her child. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what was going to happen to her. She didn't actually know she was being brought to her daughter. You will see the choice and the agony in Miss Driver's voice that she had to go back to get her daughter. She feared never seeing her again. You will hear evidence, and the state's already touched on it, about evidence about searches. Miss Driver did search for other things other than how to snap a neck. She did searches that were trying to, how to find a bus ticket for a 13-month-old. How do I travel with a child I don't have a birth certificate to? There are also indications that she was understanding that she was experiencing some crazy things in her mind. She searched for schizophrenia. She searched for other ways to get mental help. Things that she was being denied. And things spiraled from there. On December 7th, 2020, the group took Chloe back to her parents' house to get the last of her belongings. They begged her to stay there with Hannah. They couldn't convince her to stay, and her parents thought about calling the police. But they also realized that that might mean that they may never see their daughter or granddaughter again. And they are still living with that guilt today. The group then left and spent the night in a hotel room. The morning of the 8th, they attended a ceremony about what's called the 12 Tribes. They then traveled towards Canton, Georgia. I expect that Mr. Spillers will tell you about a weird incident where Chloe appeared to be hallucinating or having something going on while they were at Whole Foods on the way down here. They did stop at Mr. Abelin's house to pick up some belongings that belonged to Ben Yaman. Chloe was in Canton for less than 3 hours that day. Throughout this case, you will hear evidence that everyone around her said Chloe wholeheartedly and loved and cared for her child. You will hear evidence that she was a loving and doting mother, that she tended to all of Hannah's needs, that that baby barely ever cried because of the love and attention that Chloe's. So you will hear that Chloe considered her an extension of herself, a huge piece of her, had a connection to her. That everything she did for her daughter was because she was an incredible mother. And I'm going to show you some pictures, put this kind of in context for you guys, so that you can see the physical changes involved in Chloe's life during this time. These pictures do not dispute a change in her physically and show change in her mentally. This is Chloe when she was 16 years old, before she met Ben Yaman and Ben Michael. This is Chloe with Hannah on July 12th, 2020. Her pride and joy. August 29th, 2020. Again, showing how prideful she is of her God. November 2020. November 27th, 2020. It's another angle from November 27th. Now, the state has charged Chloe with killing Hannah with malice and cruel intentions, and along with other counts set forth in the indictment. The evidence in this case, contrary to what the state is saying, is clear and overwhelming. The state doesn't want you to consider Chloe a victim of Benjamin or Jason Spiller. We're not even standing here saying that that is a full piece of what happened. We're not blaming Jason, we're not blaming Benjamin. We're not blaming Hannah. But what it is a bigger piece of this puzzle about Chloe's severe and untreated mental illnesses that she suffered in the months leading up to December 8th. You will also hear testimony that she did have these delusions, that she seemed paranoid, that she reported seeing signs of things that to you and I wouldn't be read that way. That that's all part of mental illness. We are not here to dispute what happened to Hannah. It is truly horrific. It is something that Ms. Driver thinks about every single day. You will hear evidence from witnesses who were with her leading up to this that contradict every aspect that on December 8th of 2020 that Chloe was in any right state of mind at all. You will hear testimony from those individuals who witnessed her day-to-day mental health breakdowns and delusions themselves. You will also hear testimony about how this investigation by the Canton Police Department was conducted from the very beginning as it related to her severe mental illness and her delusions. Ms. Driver was evaluated by several experts in this case, which will be presented to you in this case, including one from the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health. We expect that the evidence will show that every expert that comes before you will say that she was severely mentally ill, that she was delusional, and will offer diagnoses of specific mental health disorders. You will hear from experts that will tell you that she was suffering from these severe mental disturbances, paranoia, and psychosis on December 8th, and in the months leading up to the tragic event. They will tell you that they based their information on information they received from the state, from the defense, and from other collateral third parties. They will also tell you that the participation in this group, while initially may have been voluntary, turned into one of an involuntary nature from a psychological perspective. The state is aiming to present this case in such a deliberate manner aimed at eliciting raw emotional responses to what happened. That's it. They want you to ignore the elephant in the room, which is the mental health, which is a huge piece of this puzzle. Despite those initial reactions, we are asking you to think about this. Mothers just do not kill their kids. Ask yourself, what drives someone to do something like this to their baby and to themselves? What drives someone to do something like this who by all reports loved and cared for Hannah in the most amazing way? Listen to the evidence that's presented about what she experienced in this relationship with Benjamin and what delusions compelled her to this tragic event. Listen to what people say about her ability to know what she was doing, living minute to minute, how she'd be fine one minute and the next thing they would describe her as erratic and crazy. There is absolutely no motive in this case for her to kill her daughter. There is no other reason for her to have killed Hannah but for her psychotic symptoms and delusions that she was under on December 8th of 2020. You'll hear that from experts, but you'll hear that from the witnesses too. This is the only explanation as to what happened, and only reason that would be supported by the evidence in this case. We believe that the evidence in this case will clearly lead you to a conclusion that at the end of this case, that she's not guilty by reason of insanity. And that still, because it's provided by law, is a way to hold her responsible for these actions. We expect that that's what the evidence will show, and that will be what we will be asking for you at the end of this case. Thank you.
All right, you can go ahead and distribute the notepads and pencils, but we are going to take a recess.